It started with whispers, the kind that slip through hedges and drift down quiet suburban streets. On Mapleview Lane, the same stretch of tidy lawns and perfect porches that promised tranquility, something uneasy had begun to stir. It wasn't noise or crime or trouble from beyond the gates. It was coming from within. For most neighbors, the trouble had a name: Linda Morrison. The self-appointed guardian of the HOA, Linda had lived on Mapleview longer than anyone else. She memorized the rulebook like scripture and enforced it as though she'd written it herself. Her yard gleamed with military precision, and she saw it as proof of her civic duty. But for others, her obsession with perfection wasn't neighborly. It was invasive. Jake Turner had lived across from Linda for 5 years. He loved his house, a modern ranch-style home with a wide backyard leading to a small creek. It was quiet, shaded by trees, and completely private, or so he thought. In the beginning, he tried to stay out of HOA politics. He paid his dues, kept his grass trimmed, and stayed polite at meetings. But he had noticed Linda's presence more and more these past few months. Her walks lingered longer near his fence. The sound of gravel crunching beneath her shoes seemed to echo at odd hours. She wasn't just walking her dog or inspecting her own lawn. She was watching. Then came the notes. Folded slips of paper tucked under his doormat, written in cursive that tried to hide its malice beneath courtesy. Your trash cans are visible from the street. The back gate appears unlatched. This community values unity in appearance. They didn't come from the HOA's official stationery, but everyone knew whose hand had written them. Jake shrugged it off at first. Every neighborhood had one. Someone who turned rules into weapons, power into recreation. But then, a letter with the HOA's official seal arrived. A violation for an unapproved structure. The photo attached showed the small wooden shed behind his fence, one he'd built years earlier. The picture, however, wasn't taken from the street. It was taken from inside his backyard. The realization chilled him. It wasn't a random complaint. Someone had walked onto his property without permission. There was only one person who would dare. That evening, Jake stood at his back door as twilight fell, looking toward the shed barely visible in the fading light. The air was heavy, still, filled with crickets and the hum of distant sprinklers. He felt the violation like a weight pressing on his chest. Privacy wasn't just about space, it was about safety, about trust. And someone had crossed that invisible line. The next morning, he began making changes. Security cameras went up, small, subtle devices positioned beneath eaves and fence posts, covering every possible angle. He wasn't looking for confrontation. He wanted proof. Because in suburbs like Mapleview, truth had to be recorded to be believed. Over the following week, the neighborhood returned to its uneasy calm. The HOA newsletters continued as usual, reminders about lawn treatments, neighborhood watch meetings, and proper recycling schedules. But Jake noticed something strange. Linda's patrols became more aggressive. She walked longer routes under the excuse of morning errands, sometimes doubling back toward his property. Her gaze lingered too long on gates, on the corners of homes, as if searching for flaws. Then came the evening it happened. The footage played like a slow-burn thriller. Linda crept into frame, flashlight in hand, her face partially hidden beneath a visor. She checked behind his side gate, paused, then slipped through. Her movements were slow, deliberate, a trespasser dressed in civility. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. Jake watched in stunned silence as she paced across his backyard, inspecting his fence, peering behind the shed. It was deliberate and invasive, her authority imagined but her intrusion real. For a moment, she froze in front of one camera, her face illuminated clearly in the beam of her flashlight. One frame captured her perfectly: Linda Morrison, head of Mapleview HOA's compliance committee, trespassing in the dead of night. The proof was undeniable. What she had done wasn't community service or inspection. It was illegal. Yet Jake didn't post it or call the police right away. He sat with the footage for 2 days, thinking about the fallout it could bring. But when another letter arrived in his mailbox, another false violation, this time accusing him of unauthorized security equipment, he knew what he had to do. He uploaded the footage. By sunrise, It had spread to the neighborhood like wildfire, residents passing the link one by one. It wasn't just a local scandal anymore. It was evidence of what many had quietly suspected. Power had made Linda forget where neighborly concern ended and trespass began. By noon, the entire HOA board held an emergency meeting. Neighbors gathered on their driveways, their phones glowing with the same viral clip. And through every whisper, one thought echoed clear. If she did it to Jake, who else had she been watching? For Linda Morrison, the backyard fence she once used as boundaries of control was now the line she had crossed forever. And for Jake, it was only the beginning. The cameras had captured more than trespass. They had caught the moment a neighborhood began waking up to the truth. The reckoning hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming. By dawn, Mapleview Lane was no longer a quiet street. Phones buzzed, inboxes flooded, and whispers that once stayed behind white fences now echoed through open doors. The footage had escaped containment. It wasn't just a clip anymore, it was evidence. Proof that the HOA's own enforcer had crossed a line no rulebook could justify. The video spread first through the neighborhood's private message threads, then into surrounding communities. Someone uploaded it to a local forum, and from there it spiraled outward. The image of Linda Morrison's flashlight-lit face became the talk of every front porch, every morning jog, every casual glance from behind freshly trimmed hedges. At first, the HOA tried to control the narrative. A hastily written email went out to all residents. It called the video an unfortunate misunderstanding, claiming that Linda was performing a routine late-night property safety review. The message asked for privacy and patience as the board assesses the situation. But patience was the one thing neighbors no longer had. For years, they had obeyed, tolerated, and kept their heads down. They had paid fines for invisible weeds, been chastised for mismatched shades of paint, and endured lectures about compliance from the very woman now caught trespassing. The video flipped everything. Suddenly, fear gave way to anger. Driveways filled with quiet discussions, small clusters of residents comparing notes. One man remembered strange footprints near his side gate. Another mentioned his dog barking late at night for no reason. Someone recalled a garden tool missing, later found on the opposite side of their fence. As each person spoke, the realization settled over them like fog. This wasn't an isolated event. Linda's obsession with control had probably gone unchecked for years. Inside her own home, Linda's world began collapsing. The once pristine house was now an island of tension. Her phone rang nonstop, first from board members, then from local reporters. She refused every call, convinced it would all blow over if she stayed quiet long enough. But silence wasn't protection anymore, it was confession. When she finally emerged that evening, she found the world outside had shifted. Neighbors who used to wave now turned away. A small crowd had gathered at the end of her driveway, not shouting, just waiting. Their stillness spoke louder than any protest could. The authority she once wielded effortlessly now bounced back at her, reflected in every suspicious stare. Meanwhile, Jake stayed quiet. He didn't address the residents or post online. The truth was visible. It needed no narration. Still, the weight of responsibility sat heavy on him. He hadn't meant for things to explode this way. He only wanted privacy and fairness, yet his footage had shattered both. Every time he opened his phone, the video flashed again and again, a reminder of the chaos he'd unintentionally unleashed. But the longer he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just his story. It was everyone's. The HOA, once seen as a necessary safeguard, had become a source of intimidation. Linda wasn't the system's flaw, she was its product. By the third day, the regional news arrived. Vans lined the curbs, camera crews setting up near the entrance sign that proudly read, "Welcome to Mapleview Oaks, a community of excellence." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Residents who once avoided controversy now lined up to speak anonymously. Their words painted a picture of life under constant scrutiny, a place where control masqueraded as care. Under the camera lights, the HOA board panicked. An emergency meeting was announced, yet even that became public fodder. The minutes leaked within hours. They showed a desperate attempt to shift blame, to paint Linda's inspection as an act of community diligence gone wrong. But buried lines revealed tension between her and the other members. Some wanted her resignation immediately. Others feared looking complicit. Then came the statement from the county sheriff's office. An active investigation into possible trespassing and privacy violations. That single announcement changed everything. The HOA's credibility wasn't just in question. It was dissolving under legal scrutiny. By nightfall, the thin calm that once defined Mapleview unraveled completely. A handful of residents began posting new videos. Outside cameras catching Linda pacing the same alleys, pausing behind fences, even flashing her phone toward windows. The pattern stretched back months. Her apology, when it finally arrived, wasn't spoken. It came as a letter taped to her own mailbox. The paper was trembling in the wind when people found it the next morning. It blamed exhaustion, concern for neighborhood safety, and misunderstanding, but nobody believed it. Her intentions no longer mattered. Her actions had rewritten who she was. For the first time in decades, Mapleview's residents stood united. Fear of rules had turned into rage for reform. Conversations swelled about disbanding the HOA, dissolving the very power structure that had allowed one woman to trespass in the name of authority. Jake watched the shift unfold quietly from his porch. The security lights that once symbolized paranoia now felt like beacons of truth. His cameras had caught more than a violation. They had caught the moment a neighborhood saw itself clearly for the first time. Still, he knew this wasn't over. There would be hearings, consequences, maybe even criminal charges. But beneath all the noise, a more important question loomed over Mapleview Oaks. When power begins to rot, who holds it accountable, the enforcer, or those who allowed the fear to grow unchecked? The answer was coming soon. And for Linda Morrison, the reckoning hadn't even begun. The HOA board convened 3 days after the footage surfaced. What was meant to be a standard meeting turned into the most crowded gathering Mapleview Oaks had ever seen. Folding chairs filled the community hall, with residents spilling into the aisles, phones in hand. The same video paused on their screens. The quiet murmur of voices carried the energy of something larger. A neighborhood no longer afraid. At the front of the room sat Linda Morrison, pale and stiff, her clasped hands trembling slightly beneath the table. For years, she had been the voice of Mapleview's authority, standing at this very podium countless times to deliver rules, citations, and warnings with unwavering confidence. But tonight, that confidence had abandoned her. The meeting started with formalities, brief and perfunctory, as though anyone cared about the agenda. The board chair read Linda's official explanation aloud for record. She had been verifying property compliance under suspicion of unauthorized structures and safety hazards. The cynicism in the room was immediate, quiet scoffs, shaking heads, and folded arms. The phrase could have come straight from a politician's speech. It wasn't truth. It was cover. One by one, residents were invited to speak. Each account shared chipped away at her defense like a blade against wood. A mother described her children being frightened by someone peering over their backyard fence. A retiree admitted he'd found his garden disturbed weeks prior but never dared report it. Then came a man from the next block holding printed images from his own security footage. Linda, again, near his property line months earlier. Evidence layered over accusation until the room was heavy with revelation. The narrative Linda tried to contain had collapsed under its own weight. Jake sat in the back row, unseen but not unknown. His footage had started all of this, but he stayed silent, his presence enough to remind everyone why they were there. He hadn't wanted a witch hunt, only accountability. Yet as he watched Linda shrink before the crowd's gaze, part of him struggled between justice and pity. Still, pity could not erase truth. When it was Linda's turn to respond, her voice cracked under pressure. She spoke quickly, her words tangled in self-preservation. She claimed duty, misunderstanding, miscommunication. But for every excuse, there was evidence. Timestamps, photographs, testimonies that rendered them meaningless. Finally, the board chair announced their decision. Effective immediately, Linda Morrison was suspended from all HOA duties, pending further investigation by the county authorities. Her micromanagement had evolved into misconduct, and Mapleview Oaks would no longer carry her name on official record. For a moment there was silence, a collective inhalation, a stillness of release. Then applause rippled softly through the hall, restrained but resolute. The power that had loomed over them for years had finally cracked. But beneath the victory, something stirred. The board's shame was palpable. They had enabled Linda, signing off on her unchecked behavior with complacency disguised as cooperation. And as residents began calling for full HOA audits, whispers of wider reform emerged. Years of hidden frustrations now found their outlet. The next morning, the news broke that Linda's suspension had escalated into formal charges: trespassing, harassment, misuse of authority under community regulations. Her photograph circulated online alongside headlines describing her as a self-appointed inspector turned intruder. The viral story that began on one street now echoed across national feeds. Outside her home, the world quieted into unease. Windows remained shuttered, mail piled at her doorstep. Her control had vanished, leaving only isolation in its shadow. The same neighbors she used to scold now crossed the street to avoid her entirely. Meanwhile, Jake tried to keep life normal. But normal didn't return easily. Strangers drove past to glimpse the house from the video. News vans lingered for sound bites, and reporters left notes requesting comments. Privacy, the very thing he'd fought for, became harder to find. Despite it all, there was a change, something tangible in the air. Neighbors smiled again, genuine and unguarded. They spoke about organizing a new committee, one built not on authority but cooperation. Jake's quiet defiance had transformed into leadership, though he never asked for it. People saw him as the man who drew the line and refused to be silenced. A week after the board meeting, the HOA held one last gathering. This time it was different. No podium, no hierarchy. Residents sat in a circle instead of rows. Ideas flowed freely about rebuilding with transparency, fairness, and respect. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Linda's name never came up again, not out of censorship, but disinterest. She had become a symbol of what they no longer wanted to be. What began as a scandal had become an awakening, and for the first time in years, Mapleview Oaks belonged to its residents again. That night, Jake reviewed the old footage one last time. The glow of the monitor bathed the room in pale light. As he watched Linda's flashlight sweep across his yard, he hit pause at the moment she looked directly into the camera lens. In that frozen frame, he saw not power but fear, a reflection of someone so consumed by control that she'd lost all sense of boundaries. He deleted the video quietly, closing that chapter for good. The neighborhood didn't need reminders of the invasion anymore. What mattered was what came after. Outside, the streetlights flickered softly over Mapleview Lane. The lawn swayed in the mild breeze, and for the first time in months, the night felt truly calm. No intrusions, no paranoia, just peace. But peace, like everything worth keeping, would have to be protected. And soon enough, new challenges would test whether the neighborhood had truly learned its lesson, or if control, in another form, would rise again. In the weeks that followed, Mapleview Oaks became a mirror for consequences. The scandal that had started as one man's security footage now stood as a cautionary tale reaching far beyond its tidy streets. Local television replayed the clip for days, and online forums debated it relentlessly. Residents who once lived invisible, interchangeable lives had suddenly become part of a story about privacy, power, and justice. While the neighborhood rebuilt, Linda Morrison's world collapsed in layers. Her name, once synonymous with authority and order, had become shorthand for arrogance gone unchecked. Her face filled broadcasts, every segment framed as Mapleview's HOA trespass scandal. The woman who had controlled others' narratives for years could no longer control her own. Her resignation came swiftly after her suspension. A formal announcement mailed to every homeowner read curtly, "Effective immediately, I am stepping down to allow Mapleview to heal." But healing was not what Linda found waiting for her. She became a recluse, her curtains drawn day and night. Reporters caught glimpses of her pacing by the window or retrieving groceries at dawn to avoid confrontation. Former allies on the HOA board cut ties, eager to save their own reputations. The neighborhood she'd ruled with iron politeness now treated her name with cold silence. For every apology letter she thought of writing, one question stopped her hand. Why had she believed she was untouchable? Meanwhile, the county investigation moved forward. Detectives visited homes, gathering statements from residents who claimed she had entered their properties without permission. Some shared photos, others security logs. What emerged wasn't a single late-night incident, but a pattern, a habit of surveillance stretching back years, cloaked under inspection precedent. When the report was published, it confirmed what everyone suspected. Linda had exploited her HOA position, frequently bypassing boundaries under the guise of oversight. Dozens of infractions, no authorizations, and weeks of falsified minutes painting her as the hero of imagined emergencies. The report concluded with words that shattered any defense she had left. Gross violation of homeowner privacy. From that moment, Linda stopped appearing in person altogether. Her property fell into disrepair, an irony not lost on anyone who once feared her standards. Weeds sprouted where she had once measured grass by the inch. Paint peeled from the trim she had scolded others for neglecting. The house itself seemed to surrender, fading into the same emptiness that filled her days. Jake passed by only once after the report broke. It wasn't satisfaction he felt. It was a strange melancholy, seeing how someone who had once seemed so powerful could crumble when stripped of control. He had hoped for accountability, yes, but what played out felt heavier than victory. While Linda faded, Mapleview thrived. Freed from the weight of constant policing, the community found color again. Porches with flower pots that didn't match, lawns with edges that curved naturally instead of ruler straight. People began lingering outside without worrying about inspection. Children's laughter replaced the uneasy quiet that had ruled before. The fear had drained away, replaced by shared relief. The HOA board, facing widespread distrust, voted to dissolve itself entirely. The decision was final, unanimous. No more letters, no more fines. A collective sigh seemed to ripple through Mapleview when the last notice arrived, reading simply, "The association has been disbanded. In its place grew something unplanned. A neighborhood of volunteers." Ryan from Redwood Court organized tool shares for yard work. The Thompsons started a community garden in the vacant lot where HOA meetings were once held. Even residents who had hesitated before joined in, finding peace in simplicity. Less about perfection, more about people. Across social media, the Mapleview story became a movement. Homeowners in other towns referenced it as evidence that neighborhood oversight had gone too far, that power built on fear was never community, it was control. News anchors called Jake the man who turned his backyard into a beacon for accountability. The phrase embarrassed him, but he understood the truth in it. One camera had forced everyone to see what they had ignored for too long. As autumn came, the last chapter of Linda's downfall closed quietly. No arrests, no trial, just disappearance. Her house, foreclosed after months of neglect, was soon listed for sale. Strangers came to tour it, uninterested in its history. For locals, though, it was a reminder, a physical scar left on otherwise healed ground. Jake watched when the for sale sign went up. The grass around it swayed in the evening light, golden and quiet. He thought of how small the moment had been when it all began. A trespass under moonlight, a muted camera click. And yet, that moment had rippled outward, breaking years of silence. In the months that followed, he took down most of his cameras, leaving only one. Not for fear, but for reflection. A single unblinking eye that had seen more than anyone ever expected. It was a reminder of how easy it is to lose sight of decency when control becomes obsession. And sometimes, he thought, justice doesn't roar. It spreads quietly, until even the strongest walls begin to crack. As winter approached, Mapleview Oaks stood different now. Freer, imperfect, and honest. There were louder barbecues, brighter paint colors, and conversations across fences that once divided. Through that change, Jake understood something essential. Peace had never been about rules. It had always been about respect. And in that respect, they'd finally found what all the cameras, meetings, and threats could never create an actual community. The neighborhood had survived its reckoning, and for the first time it was truly living. By the start of the new year, the name Mapleview Oaks no longer belonged to a single neighborhood. It had become shorthand for a national conversation, a symbol of what can happen when ordinary people refuse to accept ordinary abuse. The story of one woman's trespass and one man's perseverance had grown beyond anyone's expectations, echoing across towns, real estate forums, and city council hearings. Documentaries called it the Suburban Awakening. News programs replayed clips of Jake's camera footage, the grainy image of Linda Morrison frozen mid-step under the beam of her flashlight. To strangers across the country, she had become the face of unchecked HOA power, and Mapleview the landmark of its reckoning. But for those who lived there, the story wasn't about scandal anymore, it was about renewal. The absence of the HOA had changed everything. Without rigid oversight, the neighborhood adapted naturally, rediscovering what it meant to govern itself. Instead of citations and penalties, there were conversations and collaboration. The residents who once feared eye contact now planned barbecues, helped new families settle in, and shared tools without hesitation. The lawns grew imperfect but alive, some lush, others wild, none the same. Jake noticed how easily people smiled now. Kids played soccer in driveways that once hosted neighborhood watch patrols. The silence that used to hang over Mapleview like a rulebook was replaced by the rhythm of living, the sizzle of grills, the laughter of friends, and the steady hum of normalcy. One afternoon in early spring, a journalist returned to Mapleview to record a follow-up piece. She asked Jake what had changed most since the night he uploaded that footage. He didn't give an interview. Instead, he pointed toward the community park, the one that used to host HOA meetings, and gestured at the crowd gathered there for a neighborhood cleanup. That, he said simply before walking away. The story aired later that week. But unlike before, the footage didn't focus on scandal. It showed people laughing, repainting benches, planting flowers along the pathways. The narrator described how Mapleview had emerged stronger, more united, rebuilt not by rules but by respect. The reaction was overwhelming. Across the country, other neighborhoods began organizing their own reforms. Homeowners came forward with stories of intimidation, misuse of HOA power, and privacy violations. Some cited Mapleview directly as their inspiration, calling it the place where someone finally said enough. Even local council members began referencing the case, pushing for new transparency laws and limits on HOA authority. Within months, Mapleview's transformation became a reference point in state legislation. Bills were passed requiring HOAs to publicly disclose spending and prohibit board members from entering private property without written consent. Those changes bore an informal nickname, Linda's Law. What once symbolized trespass now stood for protection. Meanwhile, Linda Morrison disappeared quietly from public record. The county had closed its investigation with small penalties and mandated community service, but her reputation never recovered. Eventually, her name faded from the headlines entirely, replaced by something more lasting. The idea she'd accidentally destroyed. Fear as control. Jake never sought the attention that followed. He still lived quietly in the same house, the same yard. His cameras now pointed not as silent guardians but as reminders. What they had captured wasn't just wrongdoing, it was courage unfolding, one frame at a time. Sometimes, late at night, he wandered out back where it had all started. The air was different now, lighter. The camera's red light blinked softly, reflecting off the grass, and he'd smile faintly at how something so small had uncovered something so immense. It hadn't just been about Linda or even the HOA. It was about how easily people give up freedom for order, and how quickly order becomes control when no one asks why. One evening, as twilight spread across Mapleview, he stood at the fence where Linda once trespassed. Beyond it, new neighbors were unpacking boxes, unaware of the history behind every house number on the street. They smiled and waved at him, and he waved back. For them, Mapleview wasn't the site of a viral scandal. It was a fresh start. Watching them, Jake realized that maybe that was the real ending. The neighborhood didn't need heroes or villains now, just neighbors learning to live side by side again. Weeks later, when the last of the reporters finally left, Mapleview's fame began to fade, replaced by quiet pride. The residents carried the memory differently, not as gossip, but as a lesson etched into their community's very soil. The scandal had torn down their walls, but the rebuilding made them stronger. They learned that peace doesn't come from power, and safety doesn't come from surveillance. It comes from trust, built slowly, by people brave enough to draw the line when no one else will. Years from now, Mapleview Oaks would still appear in textbooks and documentaries, its story told as the turning point that forced change across 1,000 neighborhoods. But to those who lived it, it would remain something far simpler, the moment they remembered they belonged to each other, not to an association. In the end, all it took was one camera, one clip, and one quiet act of resistance to remind a community that respect was not something to be enforced. It was something to be earned. And under those same streetlights that once cast shadows of fear, Mapleview Oaks finally lived in peace.